So the complementarian role really affirms that, right? This idea of being created equally in essence, but given different roles.
Okay.
So here's how we kind of understand that and put it another way. So men and women are both made by God, right? Genesis 1:26, we were created in God's image, male and female, God created us, right? We are equal in dignity, value, essence, and human nature. However, the roles that we are to play in this world are unique, right? We don't share the same positioning. So men were given the instructions to have loving authority over women, and women are to offer willing, glad-hearted, and submissive sacrifice or assistance to the male.
Okay.
And so we know that, though men and women are created equally in God's image, and we see that in Genesis, like we said, but Genesis 2 kind of bears out in its own context and what complementarians would say Paul understands as the role of nature in 1 Corinthians 11 and 1 Timothy 2. The way that men and women interact in the world is different, right? And it's intentionally different because God set it up this way for the most effective form of leadership and the way that it should be understood. And so the idea here is that females are supposed to function in a submissive role under the leadership and loving authority of the male. Now, let's be very clear before we move on here that this is always intended to be understood in the sacrificial sense, right?
Okay.
So men are supposed to lead, but are supposed to lead sacrificially there. So we
Correct.
don't want to create a straw man or a caricature of this argument if you're watching at home. The idea here is to have the best assumption about the argumentative position as you go into listening to
Correct.
the topic, right?
So in itself, this isn't necessarily something like machismo or something
Correct.
like
No,
sexism
absolutely.
or misogyny.
Right, absolutely.
Not in itself, according to this biblical understanding.
Yeah. And so the complementarian who's doing it correctly would never paint himself or herself as a sexist, right, or anything like that. And so there's kind of two specific points that relay into this complementarian viewpoint. The first one is the fall and disruption of God's created design, right? And this is a really fancy way of basically saying, like, we see, when the snake enters the garden and tempts Eve to eat the fruit, the apple, tempts Eve to eat the fruit, right? Sin basically brings chaos into God's world. And in that dispute, there's going to be enmity between the man and the wife, right? There's going to be the potential for anger or resentment or bitterness that comes out of this because their eyes being opened in this way, in the way that they understand each other. And this is what Genesis 3:15 and 16 teaches, that there's going to have to always be this conversational difficulty of women trying to usurp the authority of men and the authority that was given to men by God in creation, right? And so men either have to choose to lead this woman well, or it can be abused, right, in the way that men lead. And so again, fall and disruption of God's created design. And then when we get to the New Testament, when we see the restored picture of what this looks like, Paul, who writes Ephesians 5, uses really the example of head, male, and female in the relationship is the example of Christ and the church. So the idea here is
So what's that passage again?
Ephesians 5:22 through 33. And so
Just in your own words?
Yeah. So the idea here is we are supposed to submit to Christ, men submit to Christ, women submit to men in the same way that the church submits to Christ.
There you go.
And Christ led the church by a beautiful example of being willing to sacrifice his life for her. He dedicated himself to his bride, all of those things.
So that's the paradigm.
That is what we are supposed to be emulating as men who are followers of Jesus and who are married.
Correct.
And then the church responds to Christ by emulating what Christ does and trying to be its best version of Christ on earth.
Yeah.
And so women submit to their godly husbands by loving them and supporting them and helping them stay, in pursuit of Jesus and all the good things that come with that. And so, and then we also see that again in 1 Timothy 2, 8 through 15.
Yeah, so that's kind of an interesting passage there.
Yeah, that one's a little bit more difficult, right? For sure.
Yeah.
I mean, it can feel a little bit weird here. The idea here is we understand men and women through the way that we are created in nature, right? So Eve was created after Adam there in this idea. And so male leadership then is seemed to be restored to this Christian community of men and women who endeavor together in the journey of expressiveness, but there is still some order, right? Some hierarchical, potentially understood order in the way that those things are supposed to function in reality there.
Which admittedly is a bit foreign.
Sure.
Right? The logic is a bit foreign to how we kind of function day
Today,
to day.
yeah.
For sure. So some interesting stuff there. But I think you captured the complementarian position very fairly.